So before I begin, we're just going to mention. I think this is a set thing, but Rabbi, this year is sponsored for this academic year by Dr. and Mrs. Menachem Marcus in memory of their beloved aunts Irma Haas and Hilda Meyer. Okay, what I wanted to do today, I'm just going to step back so that I can turn back and forth, is kind of discuss a question that I think really strikes many of us around this time of the year. We're now at the end of Sefer Shemot. We're about to read Parshat Pekudei. This year, as opposed to many other years, Vayakel Pekudei are not joint parshiot. It's not a double parsha, but rather they are separate parshiot. But I think that one of the questions that kind of comes to mind for all of us as we're reading the parshiot of Vayakel Pekudei is the basic question that many Mefarshim ask us, which is why so much repetition? Why is it that the Torah goes through the commandment of building the Mishkan and the Kelim and all the Bigdei Kahuna in Parshat Truma and again in Parshat Tetzaveh? We have a break in Parshat Kitisa where it's mentioned briefly in the very beginning. Then we have this Cheta Egel. And then Vayakel Pekudei, the Torah then goes again and repeats, this time as it's constructed in detail. Why does it repeat the construction of the Mishkan, the Kelim, and all of the Bigdei Kahuna as well? And I think this is something that, like I said, it kind of jumps out at you. Because as we all know, as our Masorah tells us, the Torah never has an extra word or even an extra letter. We learn things from diukim, from inferences. It's very, very small repetitions in the Torah. And yet here the Torah goes on and spends 4 complete parshiot talking about the construction of the Mishkan and the Kelim. And the question is why? So this is, as I mentioned, not something that is my question. This has been raised by a number of the different Mefarshim. And I brought for you here, in source number 1, the way that the Abar Benel phrases the question, because I think he phrases it in a very, very strong way. Now, the Abar Benel, just to understand, when he says here, Hashela Hahei, the style of the Abar Benel is that he very often, at the beginning of a perek, lists an assortment of questions that bother him about this perek, and then he goes on to answer each of them all together. So, She'elah, hey, the 5th question that the Abar Benel raises in the beginning of Parshat Vayakel is the following. HaShe'elah hey bekefel v'hayitur she'yir'eh bezikaron melechet hamishkan. He says, what bothers me, question number 5 that I have, says the Abar Benel, is why does the Torah repeat, seemingly unnecessarily, an extra mention of the creation of the Mishkan? Kihinei. Timtza shezachra haTorah hey pa'amim. Says the Abar Benel, and by the way, the Abar Benel isn't the only one. The Ramban, as you'll see in source number 3, the Ramban mentions this as well. If you look very carefully, source number 4, says the Abar Benel, there are 5 times where the Torah repeats or relists all of the entirety of the Mishkan and all of the Kelim. Pa'am bichlal, upa'am bifrat. Sometimes the Torah simply lists all of the Kelim. It says the Aron and the Shulchan and the Menorah. It just goes through the list of all of them. Other times, it goes into detail outlining their description, which we know happens at the beginning of Parshat Terumah, and also happens in Parshat Vayakel. בפרט מלאכת המשכן וכליו. והקשה הדבר יותר בדברי משה, בסדר הזה שאמר לישראל, כל חכם לב בכם יבוא ויעשו את כל אשר ציווה השם, את המשכן ואת העלו. And then it says, one of the hardest ones is at one point, Moshe says to Am Yisrael, everyone should come and build the Mishkan, and then he goes on to list everything that needs to be built. וזכרה שם כל הדברים שציווה השם לעשותם, and Moshe goes on to list every single thing that needed to be done. ואחר כך, Zachar ha'asiyah bifrat. And then later on, once again, when it's created, it mentions it in detail. Kol davar bifnei atzmo. Says the Abar Benel, v'haya maspik sheyomar hakatuv vayomer Moshe el kol adat b'nei Israel et kol hamelacha asher tziva Hashem oto. Says the Abar Benel, we could have solved and made this week's Parsha reading much, much shorter. It could have just been, Moshe commanded Am Yisrael to build the Mishkan based on how Hashem wanted it. Nikuda, period. Why do we have all of this? And then he could have just said, and that's what they did. It could have been very clear. It could have said very clearly, Hashem commanded them to do what Moshe commanded them to do what Hashem commanded. They then went and built everything. End of story. Why does the Torah need to repeat itself? So that's the Abar Benel's question. In source number 2, the Abar Benel highlights this even more. He says, if you look at the end of Parshat Pekudei, right after we've already outlined and detailed a second time the details of every single one of the Kelim, of the Mishkan, and the outer parts of the Mishkan, and the Big Day Kahuna. After it lists all of these, the Torah then describes how the nation brought them to Moshe. Hashem then describes to Moshe how he would like them to assemble it. And then the Torah outlines how Moshe assembled it. Says the Abarbanel, again, the same question. It could have just said, and they brought everything to Moshe. Hashem said to Moshe, build it, and Moshe built it. But yet each time there, it doesn't go into the detail of identifying the physical characteristics of each one. But once again, it lists every single one of the Kalim. Why does the Torah do that? Look at source number 2. Hashela hatet. Here is in Parshat Pekudei. He's asking another question. B'ma shezachar hakatuv kan vayaviu et hamishkan el Moshe ha'oel. When Am Yisrael bring it to Moshe, they bring the ohel, and they bring this, and they bring the aron, and they bring the shulchan. V'chazar kol hakelim v'hadvarim sheniskuru b'parshiot shelamala. We just mentioned everything in Parshat Vayakel. We just outlined and listed everything in Parshat Vayakel. Zeh kama pe'amim, a few times already. V'hu kefel u'mutar mivuar. It seems to be extra. It seems to be almost unnecessary. Ki hayad dai sheyomar. It would have been enough for the Torah to say, Vayaviu el Moshe kol melechat hamishkan, vayar Moshe et kol hamelecha. And they brought everything to Moshe, and Moshe saw everything that was there. V'hinei asu kasher tziva Hashem. They did what Hashem commanded. Vayivarich otam Moshe, and Moshe blessed them. Ma tzorech b'kol she'ar ha-parshiot mehadvarim shenasu shekvar nizkaru b'seder shel mala. Why, again, does the Torah at the end of Vayakel, after it already repeated everything, go ahead and repeat it again? What's the reason for this repetition? Now, this question is strengthened by an interesting Ramban that I brought here in source number 3, where the Ramban notes, in a totally different context, that the Torah very often leaves out conversations that happened. Meaning, lest we think, well, the Torah needed to say this because otherwise we would think maybe it wasn't built or maybe it wasn't done correct. But says the Ramban in Parshat Korach, sometimes the Torah will repeat conversations. Sometimes the Torah will repeat a conversation that Hashem says to Moshe, but not tell us when Moshe told it to the people. Or the Torah will refer to us to a conversation between Moshe and the people, but never tell us when Hashem told Moshe. That doesn't mean that the other piece didn't happen. It all happened, but for whatever reason, the Torah chooses here and there sometimes to leave out certain conversations. And it's not necessarily meant to indicate that those conversations never happened. Look at source number 3. Again, the context is within the context of the story of Korach. But says the Ramban, Ukvar heriticha, I've already showed you, ki b'mikomot rabim, many times, pa'am ya'arich b'dibor Hashem el Moshe, v'yiktzor b'sipor Moshe. Sometimes the Torah will give much more detail to the commandment that Hashem gives to Moshe, but then when Moshe repeats it, it'll say, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe kol asher tziva Hashem. It'll just be very short in everything that Hashem said. Upam yasefech. Sometimes the Torah will tell us a conversation that Hashem says to Moshe very briefly, and then when Moshe repeats it to the nation, he'll outline it in much more detail. V'lifamim lo yazkir ha'echet klal. And sometimes one of them are going to be missing. Sometimes Moshe will say something, we'll be like, wait a second, I don't remember hearing that Hashem told that to Moshe. Or the opposite. Hashem will tell something to Moshe and we'll be like, wait, we never see when Moshe actually says that to the people. Kasher, like for example, Kasher ba b'ma'aseh b'nei Gad u'b'nei Ruvain. And the example he gives is in the story of b'nei Gad and b'nei Ruvain. Shesiper ha'katuv ha'ma'aseh b'Moshe b'yatzmo. Because if you look very closely at the story of b'nei Gad and b'nei Ruvain, it seems like Moshe is answering them without having any instructions from Hashem. But actually, he really is doing it based on Hashem, what Hashem told him to do. Why? Amru et asher diber Hashem le'avdecha kein aseh. If you look at the actual conversation, at some point, Hashem is mentioned, which means this clearly was commanded by God to Moshe. So what the Ramban here is highlighting for us, and I think it just strengthens our question, is we know that the style of the Torah, at least according to the Ramban, is not to necessarily include every single conversation that took place between God and Moshe, or between Moshe and the people. In which case, we're back to our question. Why does the Torah give so much detail to everything that's going on surrounding the Mishkan? Detailing the description of the Mishkan, detailing the bringing of everything to the Mishkan, all of the different pieces, again, repeating it over and over and over again. As we all know, there's a lot of different interpretations that are given for this. I'd like to do is learn together with you 3 different approaches to this question. Okay, because as I said, this is a question that jumps out at you. And many different Mefarshim refer to this question at different levels. And I think there are the different opinions, the different approaches to this question really divide into 3 separate kind of ways to answer this question. The first is really highlighted by the Ramban, but he's not the only one. And that is a group of Mefarshim who basically suggest that the repetition of the Torah has specific intent. Because of the uniqueness of the Mishkan, and because of the special nature and stature of the Mishkan, it required that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or that the Torah continuously repeat every single part of the process. Now, there's different variations within this approach, but the general approach basically is, because of the uniqueness of what we're talking about the Mishkan, we're talking about what is meant to be the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu created by man, and because of that, it needed this continuous repetition. Now, where does this come from? So this starts with the Ramban. We're not going to do the whole Ramban inside, but if you look at source number 4, first the Ramban does is he lists the 5 stages, the 5 different places where the Torah goes into detail, and sometimes it mentions it in detail, sometimes it mentions it general. And I listed it for you at the bottom here, the 5 stages according to the Ramban, the 5 places where the Torah repeats the parts of the Mishkan. So just to see that inside, just to see that for a second, at the bottom here, in English, the 5 stages according to the Ramban is, the first one is in detail, in Parshat, TORAH, and Tetzaveh. Sorry, at the end of source number 4. The end of source number 4, I kind of highlighted for you the 5 places. It's like a summary of the Ramban. The 5 places where the Torah details the building of the Mishkan. The first time is in Parshat TORAH and Tetzaveh, when it's first commanded by God to Moshe. The second one is what I call general, because it's mentioned briefly, not necessarily in detail. That's when God tells Moshe that Bezalel is going to build it. Again, that's in Parshat Ki Tisa, where Hashem says to Moshe, the person who's going to build everything is Bezalel, and here's a list of everything he's going to build. Again, listing all of the different parts of the Mishkan. The third is what I call general. Again, Moshe commands Bnei Yisrael as to what will be built. And that also is done in more general terms, not getting into the details. The fourth is what we know as Parshat Vayakel and Pekudei, when everything is detailed once again. All of the details, how long is this, how big is this, the length and the width and the height. Everything is detailed again. The fifth time, says the Ramban, is when everything is brought to Moshe. Again, that's more general, not in detail, when everything is brought to Moshe. What the Ramban does fail to mention is that there's even more than that. Even after it's all brought to Moshe, it's repeated 2 more times when God tells Moshe to assemble everything, and then he goes and assembles it all. Okay, so we have the Ramban, and what the Ramban first does, we're not going to see it inside, is he then goes one by one to each of these stages and tries to explain why he thinks each one was necessary. But at the very end, the last few lines that I have underlined for you, this is where the Ramban gives his summary of why he thinks this is all necessary. V'al haklal, kol ze derech chiba v'derech ma'ala. All of this entire repetition, the idea that everything is repeated so many different times, says the Ramban, this is all out of a show of love. Lomar ki chafetz Hashem b'melacha, umaskir ota b'torato pa'amim rabot, leharbot schar le'oskim ba. Okay, basically it's to show how much God appreciated the work that was done, and how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu valued the Mishkan and the Kelim and the Begadim of the Kuhuna. And therefore, in order to show that, it repeats it over and over again. Like somebody who constantly loves to talk about something that is important to him. And every time you mention, did I tell you more about this? And like someone who likes to talk about something that's special to them. And then every time they show it to somebody, they describe it, where they got it, how they got it. So here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is showing that love by constantly outlining all the different aspects. That's why it says it many times. K'inyan masha amru b'midrash yafes sichat avdei avot lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitoratam shel banim shaharei parshato shel Eliezer shnayim ushlosha dapinhi. And then he references a well-known midrash. This midrash is from Sefer Bereshit. As we may remember in Sefer Bereshit, in the story of when Avram sends his servant Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak, the conversation that happens between Eliezer and Rivka is repeated 2 to 3 times. Why is it repeated so many times? So the Medrash says it's to show, as the Medrash says here, Yafes sichat avdei avot lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to show how much Hashem appreciates even just the basic conversations between the servants of the avot, to show how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves his people. Okay, so according to the Ramban, it says the Ramban is the same thing here, by reiterating the beauty and the details of the Beit Hamikdash, of the Mishkan and its Kelim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was showing how important it is. And as I said, it's similar like somebody who has something special, that every time someone says, I love your necklace, you say, do you know where I got it from? The details themselves are what show how beautiful and how important it is. So that's the Ramban. Now Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has a similar idea, but he kind of takes it in a little bit of a different direction. He also says that the reason why this is repeated is because it's important that every single detail be repeated, but not just to show the love that Hashem has for the Mishkan, but actually because of when we're dealing with something of tremendous symbolism, kavana and intent is very important. Rather than we'll read his words together, and then we'll kind of unpack it a little bit. Says Rav Hirsch in source number 5. If we realize that the whole sanctuary was to have symbolic meaning in all its parts, but that no object can stand as a symbol if it is not intended and made to be that symbol, meaning something which is meant to be symbolic can only be symbolic if when it's created, there is the intention and the meaning that is put into that symbol as it's created. If further we remember that the realization of the symbolic use of everyday objects and the sanctuary consisted of such, meaning many things in the Beit HaMikdash and Mishkan were just regular objects, a shulchan, there were many things that could have been regular things that only gain meaning if as you create them, you have the proper intent, which are normally in ordinary use, having their concrete meaning as a cupboard, a table, lamp, curtains, clothes, etc., requires quite special stress on their being symbolic. Then all these considerations make it quite understandable to us why here, from 38, again, these are just the prakim, the making of the Mishkan is described again in all its details. Although we know all these details already from the previous chapter, when the commands ordering them were given. So says Rav Hirsch, it needs to be clear that we're talking about something that has symbolism and meaning, that every step of the process was done with the full intent for that symbolism and meaning. And then he continues. Also that in Parak 39, all the single articles are again mentioned when they were delivered. And the erection is again described of each individual part, and the Torah does not find it sufficient simply to say, the artists and artisans carried everything out in accordance with the instructions, brought it all to Moshe, and Moshe erected the sanctuary as he had been commanded. Meaning, again, says first, why does it just say Moshe did what he was commanded? The people did what they were commanded, and Moshe did what he was commanded. Says Rav Hirsch, if we are not mistaken, all the prolixity is meant to tell us that both at the making, as well as the delivering, and finally at the assembling, and this is the key, and the erecting, the holy and symbolic meaning and purpose of each and every part which made up the whole edifice was present and vivid in the minds of the workers and Moshe. So that each part and the whole was made, delivered, and set up in the spirit of its purpose. And so the symbolic character and meaning of this whole edifice and every part of it was vindicated. What's Rav Hirsch basically saying? We'll just say it in different words, and this is something that a number of people have suggested. Whenever you're dealing with something which is connected to Avodat Hashem and spirituality and holiness, there could be a very, very fine line between it being the holiest part of one's life or potentially the most dangerous. And what's the difference between when something becomes the thing with which you use it to serve God in the highest way, as opposed to something which you may chas v'shalom use totally for avodah zarah for something else? The fine line is whether you do it with the right intent. And so when Hashem commanded them to build every single part of the Mishkan, the Torah needed to be clear that not only was it that Hashem commanded to be built in a certain way, but they made sure to build it in that way. And they delivered it in that way. And Moshe erected it in that way. Because when you're dealing with areas of service to God, you have to make sure that the greater the potential for holiness, the greater the danger. And therefore, when we're talking about service to God, something like the Mishkan and the Kelim, things that could chas v'sholem, if understood inappropriately or improperly, could have been used for avodah zarah chas v'sholem. It had to be very clear that they were made exactly as God commanded, with the right intention that God intended. Okay, just to even kind of highlight this, some of the Mefarshim note that one of the fundamental questions is, what was the difference between the Mishkan and the Cheder and the Egel? Now again, we're not going to get into all the details. There's lots of different interpretations as to what the sin of the Egel exactly was. But if we ask the fundamental question, which is, let's one of the suggestions is that Cheder Egel was away for Am Yisrael. What was the sin of the golden calf meant to be? They were looking for a way to serve God, a way to connect to God, an intermediary between them and God. So then the question can become, well, if that's what they were looking for, how is the Mishkan different from the golden calf itself? And the answer would be, one was commanded by God, and one was not commanded by God. And sometimes the difference between the holiest service to God and a total, rejection of God can simply be whether, it could be you built the same thing, but what was your intent? What did you have in mind? What were the things you were thinking about? And therefore, says Rav Hirsch, when it comes to the symbolism and the meaning of the Mishkan, everything needed to be not just commanded in a certain way, it needed to be built in a certain way, it needed to be assembled in a certain way, and therefore, the Torah specifically goes out into detail to say everything was done exactly the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded. Okay, so what we've seen so far, to our question, which was why does the Torah repeat itself? We've seen the suggestion number one is it was done with purpose. There was a reason why everything needed to be repeated. It was important because of the uniqueness of the Mishkan that everything be repeated. Either because, according to the Ramban, it shows how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu loved the Mishkan and loves OUisrael, the home that he's built, or because when you're dealing with something of such import and such holiness, there always needs to be tremendous care that it's done in the proper way. Because any kind of perversion of what is commanded could totally take you in an entirely different direction. And therefore, says Rav Hirsch, the symbolism, these kelim needed to be built and created exactly the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu did, asked them to, and the Torah needs to outline that and let us know that to make sure that we don't chas v'shalom think otherwise. Okay, so that's suggestion number one. Suggestion number one is that is why the Torah repeats itself in order to stress something unique about the Mishkan. Yes?
I have two questions. First of all, how to build the Beit HaMikdash?
Excellent question. Okay, so the first question that was asked was, you're talking about how it was repeated over and over. Were there actually any differences between the way it was repeated the first time and the second time? The answer is yes, and that's going to be the next thing we're going to say. Number one. Number two, the question was, we hear all about the Mishkan. What about the building of the Beit HaMikdash? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Okay, the Beit HaMikdash is built. The Beit HaMikdash was the Mishkan was with Am Yisrael throughout the Midbar. Okay, throughout till the end of the Torah. Say for Yoshua, they enter the land of Israel, and for not many years, the Mishkan was kind of roaming around in different places, but basically all the way until Melachim Aleph, or maybe Melachim Bet, forgive me, which is basically when Shlomo HaMelech builds the first Beit HaMikdash. That is when and there it's built in detail. Now there, it's different. It was an actual structure, a building. It was a much more magnificent structure. Many of the aspects of what we see in the Mishkan, the Aron from the Mishkan is then brought into the Beit HaMikdash. It was a much bigger and much more grandiose type of building, but absolutely, in the Navi, it describes it. And then again, it also describes, after the exile of the first Beit HaMikdash, it describes the building of the second Beit HaMikdash, although the second Beit HaMikdash was built on a much lower level, things were missing. But so the answer is that in Nevi'im is where they describe the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so the second direction to answer this question is a number of Mefarshim point out that actually, if you look closely at the different repetitions, there are some differences. Okay, one meaning if you look at the way that the Torah describes Hashem commanding the building of the Mishkan in Parshat Terumah and Tetzaveh, and then you look at how they're built in Parshiot Vayakel and Pekudei, there are a number of major differences. In which case, maybe there's something we can learn from the fact that there are differences and why HaKadosh Baruch Hu choose to do that. The most famous difference, does anyone know what's the most famous difference between the way that it was commanded by God initially and the way it was actually built? Anyone know?
The order?
The order of good?
The order, I guess it was like from the outside to the inside.
Excellent. So if we look at, we're going to skip now to source number 7. We'll go back to source number 6. Look at source number 7. Source number 7, Rashi quotes a very, very famous midrash regarding one of the most major changes that happened in Parshat Vayakel Pekudei when the Beit HaMikdash is built, when the Mishkan is built, versus the way it is stated when it was first commanded by God. This is at the beginning of Parshat Vayakel, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu outlines that the people who are going to build the Mishkan are Bitzalel, Ben Uri, Ben Chor. Says Rashi, and he quotes a medrash, the pasuk says, "Ubitzalel Ben Uri asa et kol asher tziva Hashem et Moshe." That Bitzalel did everything that Hashem commanded Moshe. Says Rashi, why does it say the way that Hashem commanded Moshe? But it doesn't say Asher Tziva Moshe in Ktiv Kam. It should say that Bitzalel built according to the way that Moshe commanded him. Because who's the one who spoke to Bitzalel? It was Moshe who spoke to Bitzalel. So why does it say that Bitzalel built the Mishkan according to the way that God commanded Moshe, as opposed to saying according to the way that Moshe commanded Bitzalel? Says the famous Medrash, there must have been a discrepancy between what God told Moshe and what Moshe actually told Bitzalel. What is that discrepancy? Ela kol asher tziva Hashem et Moshe, afilu dvarim shelo amar lo rabo. Hiskima da'ato lima shene'emar leMoshe miSinai. Says the Midrash, quoted by Rashi, there was one major aspect that in the way that God originally told it to Moshe, when he told it to Bitzalel, told it a little bit differently. And Bitzalel was somehow, due to his unique nature, able to really understand that the way Moshe was telling was not really the correct way, but God had told it to Moshe differently. What are we referring to? Ki Moshe tziv'a leBitzalel lasot tchila kelim v'achar kach mishkan. Moshe commanded Bitzalel to do it in the following order. Moshe said to Bitzalel, the first thing you need to build is the Aron. And then after that, you should build the Mishkan, the Shulchan. And then after that, the Menorah. First start with the Kelim, and then at the very end, you should build the outer structure of the Mishkan. That's the way Moshe commanded it to Bitzalel. Turns Bitzalel to Moshe. Amar lo Bitzalel, minhag olam la'asot tchila bayit, v'achar kach mesim kelim b'tocho. Says Bitzalel to Moshe. Moshe, that doesn't make any sense. Normally, if a person is building a home, first they build the outer structure to the home, and then they build the furniture inside. Why would you build the furniture first and then not have nowhere to put it? So says Bitzalel, it doesn't make much sense. Amar lo, answers Moshe, Kach shamati mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You know what, Bitzalel, you're right. I actually heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu the way that you're suggesting, that first you should build the outer structure of the Mishkan, and then you should build the Kelim. Amar lo Moshe, Bitzel el Hayita. You must have been right nearby when God was talking to me in the shadow of God. Ki bevadai kach tzivali HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is actually what HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded me. You're right, Bitzalel. That's why his name is Bitzalel, because he's basically saying, you must, and I don't think it means that Bitzalel was literally standing there when God spoke to Moshe, but Moshe is basically saying, you were somehow mechavein, you understood what God really wanted, and therefore you're Bitzalel, and that's why we should call you Bitzalel. So what happened here? Moshe understood or commanded Bitzalel to first build the Kelim and then the Mishkan. Bitzalel said that doesn't make any sense. It goes against all nature, because it goes against what we normally do. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then Moshe said, you know what, you're right. You actually are correct. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu really wanted to be done was to build the structure first, and then to build the Kelim. A beautiful medrash, and it's a beautiful idea for how he got his name. But there's one major problem with this. I would say maybe even two major problems with this. What are some questions with this?
Well, actually, I thought that Baruch Hu had no more problems like that.
Okay, so good. Okay, so good. So I would say it this way: the problem with, or the challenge of this medrash, is that the implication of this medrash is that when God told it to Moshe, He told it with the home first, and then the inside. But if we look at Parshat Terumah, which ostensibly says Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, God told to Moshe, what's the order in Parshat Terumah? The Kelim first, and now the outer structure. So the Medrash will say, no, that wasn't what Hashem told Moshe, that's how Moshe understood it from God. But that's not necessarily the way that it's understood in the actual text. Meaning, if you look at the text itself, it seems like that's the way Hashem told Moshe. That's number one. Number two, if in fact God did tell Moshe to build the structure first and then the Kelim, so then why did Moshe switch it? Meaning, if Bitzalel's right, that Hashem was the one, Hashem had told him one way. So why, when Moshe told it to Bitzalel, did he switch the order? Okay, so these are two questions. Two questions you need to understand about this medrash is, number one, let's assume this medrash is right, okay? And originally God told Moshe to build the Aron first, and to build the outer structure and then the Kelim. Number one, why does Moshe change it when he talks to Bitzalel? And number two, in the text itself, it seems to indicate that when God told Moshe, that Parshat Terumah, which is when God commands it to Moshe, that seems to be God telling Moshe what to do, and there it says, build the Kelim first. So the Maharal in Gur Aryeh, first he deals with question number one. He deals with the question of where did Moshe go wrong here? Meaning, we have to assume, most of our tradition is that most of the Torah that we have nowadays is from Moshe, meaning we got it from Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told it to Moshe, which means much of our Masorah, much of our tradition is dependent on a certain understanding that everything that Moshe told us came from Hashem. And here Moshe seems to make a clear mistake. Where did that mistake come from? Why was Moshe mistaken in thinking that you build the Kelim first and then you build the structure? Whereas HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him the opposite. So says the Gur Aryeh, Moshe, it wasn't a mistake, it came from a differing perspective, which is similar to what you were describing, but it came from a different perspective in how Moshe saw things and in his reality. He says the following. The Im Tomar, source number 8. Umoshe lama lo tziva lasot mishkan kodem. if you're going to basically ask the question, which is, if God told Moshe to build the outer structure first, so why did Moshe not do that? Why did Moshe command Bezalel differently? Yesh lomar, de Moshe haya makdim et hakelim, de harei hakelim hem chashuvim min hamishkan. Moshe's perspective was, when it comes to what to build first, the question you need to ask is, what's the most important thing that you're going to build? And if you ask most people, what's more important, the outer structure of the Mishkan or the kelim with which we were going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, most of us would say it was the kelim. And so Moshe was thinking, Moshe had a very, very unique focus, which is, from a spiritual perspective, what's more important? And since what's more important from a spiritual perspective is the building of the kelim, that's what he told Bezalel to do. One of the ways that we know about it is because of who got to carry what. And one of the ways he proves this is who carried the kelim. The most important children of Bnei Levi, they carried the kelim, which means the kelim were more important than the outer structure. Aval be'inyan ha'ma'aseh. However, so that was Moshe's perspective. Moshe was the most spiritual being that ever lived. And when Moshe was looking at the kelim and the Mishkan, to him, the most important thing was the kelim, and therefore let's build the kelim first. But Bezalel, what's Bezalel? Bezalel is a craftsman. He's an artisan. What does he look at when he's looking at what to build? The practical. He's saying, well, what should come first when it comes to practicality? Binyan ha'ma'aseh yesh lahakdim et hamishkan. When it comes to the actual building, of course it makes more sense to build the Mishkan first. Because the only way to preserve what you're going to build is if you have an outer structure. Bezalel, whose his main perspective was, how do you carry out the reality? How do you take the spiritual part of what we're trying to do and bring it into and make it practical? So Bezalel looks at Moshe and says, Moshe, this doesn't make any sense. Aval Moshe, al halimud bilvad, but Moshe, whose goal was the spiritual makeup of the people, the learning, v'haya yodea tziur hamishkan, v'zeu halimud ech yitzaveh, hitchil bekelim tchila. There, Moshe, whose perspective was from a spiritual perspective, he would start with the kelim, but you need the Bezalel to come and say, this is the way to do it. It kind of reminds me of like sometimes, why men need a wife, right? Sometimes men have this idea, and they need a wife to like tell them, no, this is not how you do it. If you really want to do it, this is what you got to do, right? Or just people who need each other to complement each other. Moshe was basically coming and saying from the spiritual perspective, the Aaron and everything it means, and that's going to be the focus of everything. Comes Bezalel and says, Moshe, that's great and all, but in the end of the day, if you're going to build something, you want to make sure it lasts, you got to build the outer structure first. Okay, so what the Maharal shares beautifully here is he's also highlighting for us the different perspectives that people will take on different areas depending on their inner nature. Moshe's inner nature was purely spiritual, and therefore his focus was in one direction, whereas Bezalel had a different role, and therefore his perspective was totally different. So what the Maharal has explained for us is why Moshe asked, or why Moshe commanded in the way that he did. What the Maharal doesn't explain is, well, why does the Torah phrase it the way that this in Parshat Terumah? Why does the Torah phrase it that Moshe asked, that God told Moshe? It would seem to be that what the Torah is based, what we would probably suggest is that the reason why the Torah says that God commanded Moshe to build the kelim first is because that's how Moshe interpreted it. Meaning Moshe's interpretation of what he heard was to build the kelim first, and therefore that's what he heard. Okay, what we've seen, just to kind of summarize what we've seen, is the second approach that we're trying to give to why the Torah repeats itself is the Torah repeats itself. We haven't really gotten to the crux yet. It repeats itself because each time that the Torah talks about the creation, a different aspect is highlighted. Okay, now according to the Midrash, what the Torah is basically saying is that there was almost a mistake here. Moshe thought one way, and Bezalel saw another way. But the way that the Abarbanel interprets this is a little bit different. Says the Abarbanel, and he says something similar, the same idea that there were a number of differences between the way the Mishkan was commanded initially in Parshat Terumah and the way it's built. Says the Abarbanel, why would God do that? Let's assume, and the Abarbanel, by the way, assumes, not like this Midrash, that actually the way God commanded it was to build the kelim first. Says the Abarbanel, God commanded him to build the kelim first, and then the outer structure, but yet when they did it, they did the opposite. And that was also based on what God wanted. Well, then why would God do that? Says the Abarbanel, because each of these sequences highlighted different spiritual priorities and things that we need to take into account. And sometimes the Torah will repeat certain things, but have differences in the way that they're phrased or the way that things are carried out in order to highlight these differences. So says the Abarbanel, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu command the Aron to be created, to be built first? Because he wanted everyone to realize that what's going to be the central focus point of everything that's going to be built? The Aron. And that's why after that he commands to build something else. Why does it, so says the Abarbanel, this wasn't just a question of Moshe misinterpreting or misunderstanding based on his perspective. Says the Abarbanel, this was just a function of HaKadosh Baruch Hu trying to get across that sometimes there are two messages, and the Torah will repeat something and with minor differences in order to highlight different priorities. At first, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands the building of the Mishkan with the Kelim in order to show that what's the focal point of the Mishkan? The Kelim. But then when it's actually built, it's changed in order to show that even though you have the focal point, which is the Kelim, on the other hand, you also have to remember, you can't forget about the practical aspects of life, which is sometimes you need to build the structure before you build the Kelim. So says the Abarbanel, and this is the key, why does the Torah repeat itself? It repeats itself because of these differences. The Torah is trying to highlight. It could be initially, why does it first say that the Aron is important? So that we always remember what's the most important of the Kelim, the Aron. Why is the Mishkan built? For the Kelim. Ultimately, when it's built, you have to also take into account practical considerations, as B'Tzalel says to Moshe. But the fact that it's told in two different times comes to highlight different priorities and different values. Another way of saying this is, what's more important at the end of the day? Building the structure first or building the kelim first? The answer is you need both. Ultimately, practically, you're going to need to build the structure before you build the kelim, because you have nowhere to put the kelim. But why does God command the kelim first? To remind us, never think the structure becomes more important than what you do inside. Never put so much focus on the outer building and less focus on what you're doing. Again, lahavdil. It's a question of, here in Eretz, less of an issue. But, we think about many shuls in America, my own childhood shul as well, about the amount of money that is put into the edifice of what is built, and how much effort and money and time is put into what is done inside. Now, does that mean you shouldn't worry about the outside? Does that mean that the shul shouldn't take pride in the beautiful buildings that they're? Of course, that also shows values. The fact that they're putting the money into the shul, not just putting it into their homes. The fact that they're putting it, of course, that shows the value. But you always have to have that balance between how you look at the outer structure and how much effort and time and focus you put on what you do inside that structure. And perhaps the Torah, by shifting in the two times that it repeats things, is to show that there is a difference between those. So we have to find that balance between, on the one hand, having a proper structure to take care of everything that we need to take care of, but making sure that we don't lose focus on the most important, which is what we do inside that structure. So if it's okay, just wait till the end, and that I'll take wait questions at the end, just because of time, because we started a little bit late. So we've seen two explanations for why the Torah repeats itself. Number one is the Torah repeats itself in order to highlight the uniqueness of the Mishkan, either because it's special and beloved by God, or as Rav Hirsch said, because the potential danger in perversion of the building of the Mishkan, it needed to stress that everything was done based on the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded. And the second reason why it's repeated is because when we look at the repetition, there are certain nuances that are changed, perhaps to highlight for us the importance of balancing different values. The third explanation, the third approach to understanding this repetition actually comes on the heels of another very important question that is connected to these parshiot, and that is the question of the order of the parshiot. When we look at the order of the parshiot are as follows. Parshat Truma Tetzaveh, God commands the creating of the Mishkan. Right after that, in Parshat Ki Tisa, we have the sin of the golden calf, followed by Vayakel Pekudei, the actual building of the Mishkan. And according to many Meforshim, the Ramban is the most prime one, that is the order that it's supposed to be. In which case, God first commands the Mishkan, then the sin of the golden calf occurs, and only afterwards they build the Mishkan. They actually carry out God's initial commandment. But there are some, Rashi chief among them, who actually changes the order. If you look at source number 9, Rashi points out that when the Torah describes the sin of the golden calf, says Rashi, Ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. Some certain times, at certain points in time, the stories in the Torah are sometimes out of order. Now, this doesn't mean that everything that happens in the Torah is totally out of order. It means there are certain times where Chazal will see value or understand that one story, even though it's written in one place, actually took place earlier. What's an example? Says Rashi, Maaseh ha'egel kodem litzivoy melechet hamishkan yamim rabim haya. The sin of the golden calf actually took place before God even commanded the Mishkan. Sharei b'shivasar b'Tammuz nishtabru aluchot. The 17th of Tammuz is when the luchot were broken. V'yom HaKippurim ditratzeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael. And on Yom Kippur, which was many days later, is when God forgave Am Yisrael 80 days later. Ulemacharat hitchilu b'nidvat HaMishkan. And only after that, after Yom Kippur, is when they started to build the Mishkan. So says Rashi, the proper order in the Torah itself, it's commandment of the Mishkan, Chet HaEgel, building of the Mishkan. Says Rashi, no, what it really should be is Chet HaEgel, commandment of the Mishkan, building of the Mishkan. And that's what Rashi says, and the Medrash in source number 10, we're not going to see it inside, also suggests this, because what actually comes out, according to Rashi, we're not going to spend too much time on this now because of time, what actually comes out, according to Rashi, is that perhaps the commandment to build the Mishkan might have been a response to Chet HaEgel. That if not for Chet HaEgel, and the Sforno actually suggests this, and the Medrash seems to suggest this, maybe there would not have even been a need or any discussion of having a Mishkan, which is mind-boggling, because if you think about how much of the Torah is connected to korbanot and everything we do and the Mishkan and this and that, it's mind-boggling to think that it was only born out of a sin as opposed to part of the original plan. It's fascinating. We're not going to spend too much time on that now because of time, but it's a fascinating question. But according to Rashi, if that is the case, and according to this Midrash, that it was really basically Chet HaEgel, command to build the Mishkan, building of the Mishkan, then our initial question is a very good question, which is, if the building came right after the commandment, then why the repetition? And then we have the answers that we just suggested. However, the Ramban, in source number 11, vehemently argues on Rashi. The Ramban says that Rashi's suggestion that the Chet HaEgel happened before the commandment to build the Mishkan is just not true. He says we don't. There is no such thing. We always follow the order of the Torah. And again, we're not going to see it inside, but the Ramban basically argues and suggests, no, what really happened was God commanded the building of the Mishkan. That was commanded without any sin. Then there was Chet HaEgel, and then there was the building of the Mishkan. Now, according to the Ramban, perhaps we can suggest, and we're going to see that there are those who do suggest, that there was a very valid reason why the Torah had to repeat the creation of the Mishkan in detail. Because it wasn't like God commanded it, and then it was built, and nothing happened in between. Something very, very big happened in between. What happened in between the commandment and the building? Chet HaEgel. And Chet HaEgel is a game changer. Chet HaEgel could have potentially shifted dramatically our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It might have even shifted dramatically to the point that maybe there might have been some of us who might have thought that after Chet HaEgel, maybe God's command to build the Mishkan no longer applied. How do we know the Kadosh Baruch Hu still wanted us, after such betrayal, to still build the Mishkan? And not only to still build the Mishkan, but to build it in the same way. Therefore, the Torah needs to repeat itself to show that despite the betrayal, despite the sin of the golden calf, nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu not only commanded them to build the Mishkan and to build the Kelim, but it still was in the same way. And I brought for you... I wasn't even actually asked to do this, but this is a nice little shout out to Torah Tidbits. Those of you who read Torah Tidbits may have read this past week. There's a beautiful essay by Rabbi Moshe Taragin, specifically on this point, highlighting this exact point that I wanted to just read for you very, very quickly, because he basically points out that the reason why the Torah needs to repeat itself is specifically because to show that despite the betrayal of Chet HaEgel, the relationship between God and HaKadosh Baruch Hu nevertheless was able to be restored. Was able to be. Oh, what did I say? Sorry. Between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael was able to be restored in a beautiful way. And he quotes Mori Rabbi, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who I had the privilege to learn by for a few years as well. A little over 20 years ago, we're in source number 12. My revered Rabbi Mori, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, delivered a legendary speech addressing this riddle. He spun an enchanting story to illustrate the reason for the Torah's verbosity. He told the story of a groom and a bride visiting a store a few days before their wedding to select furnishings for their new home. They strode leisurely through the store, patiently considering each furniture option. Their relaxed pace stemmed from the fact that, for them, selection of furniture wasn't just a logistical or practical issue. Each furnishing evoked their hopes and dreams for their future. As they chose dining room furniture, I still remember the time my wife and I were going and registering all these different things, right? It represented much more than spending time together. It represented the building of a home. They imagined it decked out for Shabbat and surrounded by family. As they selected kitchen furnishings, they dreamed of preparing food for guests. As they chose their bedroom furniture, they envisioned the many private moments they would spend together. Each decision and each selection was a labor of love. The furniture was ordered and stored in anticipation of the wedding day. Shockingly, the night before the wedding, the bride betrayed her husband. The next day, the appalling news broke, and the entire wedding disintegrated into anger and vitriol, as both families stormed out of the wedding hall in outrage. Realizing that his marriage was doomed, the groom contacted the furniture store to cancel the furniture order. For months, the two parties didn't speak. At some point, though, a relative of the bride contacted the groom, pleading with him to consider a possible rapprochement. At first, he was horrified by the notion, but ultimately he agreed, hesitatingly, to meet the woman who had so deeply insulted him. Though at first it was extremely awkward, ultimately they agreed to reunite, and after many meetings, the wedding was rescheduled. A few days prior to the wedding, the groom and bride returned to the furniture store to select new furniture. This time, however, every selection was cloaked with pain and anguish. Instead of the love and anticipation which had sparked their initial visit, they were now haunted by suspicion and distrust. They had little appetite for leisurely suggestions, but instead made hurried decisions, ordering whatever floor models were available. The selection of furniture was now emotionally burdensome and laborious. They had little desire for details. Human beings can forgive each other, but can rarely remove the scars of past wounds. We can summon generosity of spirit and forgive those who injured us, but the pain rarely disappears. Even after forgiveness, the relationship is rarely the same. After it heals, it still hurts. Hashem is different. He promises that after forgiveness, we can still return to our original state of innocence. The bold announcement of Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem, that we should renew our days as they were, invites us to return to our original state of purity prior to our religious breakdown. The betrayed husband forgave his wife, but their relationship would never be the same. He could not select the furniture with the same enthusiasm he once felt. By contrast, Hashem, our husband, reboots our relationship just as it was. His excitement about the Mishkan and its furniture is just as enthusiastic as it was prior to the debacle of the eagle. The lengthy repetition of Mishkan details in Vayakel emphasizes that Hashem forgave us as if the Egel betrayal never occurred. The details matter to him now, just as they did before. We'll just skip to the very last paragraph, the last few lines. The repetition of details in Vayakel is Hashem's way of signaling that he loves us as deeply as he did before our betrayal. The details of our home and the dimensions of our furniture are just as endearing to him now as they were before. We returned to innocence. Beautiful, beautiful.
Even Moshe reached a higher level.
Correct. So what we see here again.
He reached a higher level.
Corridor Panav. Yeah, that's correct. That's true. But that's a different point. But I did look for the actual a write up of the actual. The actual shir that was given by Rav Lichtenstein online, I couldn't find it, but the way that Rav Moshe Targum describes it is so beautiful. Just to summarize, we started with 30 seconds. We had a question. The question was, why the repetition? Why does the Torah go in such detail to repeat so much of the creation of the Mishkan? So we saw three approaches. Approach number one was the Torah does that specifically because of the uniqueness of the Mishkan, either because to show how much Hashem loves the Mishkan and how precious it was to him because of what it represented, or because of the potential danger when dealing with a Mishkan whose job it is to bring you close to God. It needs to be done exactly as God commanded it and in no other way, and to stress that. The second approach was to highlight differences in the way it was originally commanded versus the way it was actually carried out, where on the one hand that seems a little bit funny, but it actually comes to highlight the balance between different values that sometimes we have when we're making decisions about how to create and how to do things. And the third approach is the beautiful approach that was suggested by Rav Lichtenstein as recorded by Rav Moshe Targum, that if we understand, according to the Ramban, that there was a major event that happened in between the commandment of the Mishkan and the creation of the Mishkan, then there is justification for the repetition. To show that even after everything that happened, Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem, our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu was able to be restored into the way that it originally was, and therefore every detail, every aspect of our relationship as it was recorded in Parshat Truman Tetzaveh was maintained in Vayakel Pekudei despite the break that occurred.